All right, welcome everybody to the Environmental Communications Seminar at the Program on the Environment at the University of Washington. My name is Sean McDonald. I'm an instructor for this course and the host for this evening. We've got a fantastic speaker here in week six of the quarter already. We have Jamie Caladonis. She's the Campaign Communications Director for Greenpeace USA, and the seminar today will focus on communications in environmental advocacy. Jamie has more than a decade of experience in communications with a variety of advocacy organizations. Just so everyone's aware, those in the room and also online on Zoom and elsewhere, our guests will start off with a short presentation, and then we'll jump into audience-driven questions. For the folks in this room, obviously, just raise your hand and you can ask your questions of our speaker. But if you're on Zoom, I would encourage you to raise your little digital hand. You can ask your question out loud if you'd like by just turning on your microphone and your camera, and we can go ahead and have that conversation. Or you can add your questions to the chat. We'd like to get a lot of questions for our speaker today. So a little bit about our speaker before I turn it over to her. Jamie has led an applications program that was recognized by an independent monitor as punching above its weight, and developed a communications program that contributed to several major insurance companies making climate commitments. Jamie's experience in achieving top-tier coverage of climate issues in the US and internationally, such as securing Washington Post coverage of the insurance industry's role in climate change. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree, East Asian Studies degree in Japanese and English Literature from the University of Pennsylvania, and a Master of Arts in Japanese History from Columbia University. So I'm going to go ahead and thank you, Jamie, for being with us. And let's go ahead and give her a big round of applause. We can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure that I've got video and audio sharing as well. And I want to be able to see you all. Show video panel. Okay. I can see from the video that this is up on the screen, but yes, hello everyone. Really glad to be here with you all today. Feel like I've lived my life on Zoom these days, and yet this one is still a bit of a new experience for me. So really excited to be able to speak with you. As Sean mentioned, my name is Jamie. I use she, her pronouns. I live on the lands of the Chinook people in Portland, Oregon, but I'm currently in DC on unceded Piscataway land. And as was also mentioned, I have spent my career in communications. I started out actually as a journalist at the UN, but realized very quickly that I wanted to spend my career advocating for something I believed in, and specifically that I wanted to harness the power of communications to fight against climate change. I have always seen people as really being the heart of that fight. So started out by spending 5.5 years, I think, working for the recognition of Indigenous and community land rights, which we know from science is absolutely critical to protecting forests and to mitigating climate change. I worked closely in that position with Vicky Talley-Corpus, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous peoples' rights, to advocate for Indigenous rights recognition all over the world. This is also where I started to build and manage communications teams and realize how much I love doing that. Media outreach has kind of been my bread and butter, one of the main tools that I've used. But I've worked on strategies that span the spectrum. I really believe in always starting from the position of what are we actually trying to do with communications? How do we use it to win? I'm really very much a campaigner at heart. So more recently, I moved to the Sunrise Project, where I was working to stop insurance companies from supporting climate change. May seem like a bit of an unlikely target, but just like you can't drive your car without insurance, you also can't build an oil pipeline or operate a coal mine. And so those are really important targets in the fight against climate change. I'll come back to that example later. But most recently, I have joined Greenpeace USA as the campaign communications director. So I work across campaigns to end the era of fossil fuels, protect our oceans and forests, and fight for the right to protest and speak out, which is what allows us to do all of that advocacy in the first place. So I am going to dive into some specific campaigns, but first I think it's very much worth mentioning that the opportunity for climate and environmental communications is massive. There are an unprecedented number of Americans who want to do something about climate change. 70% say it's important to them personally. And what we've seen from multiple studies on this issue is that it's not about convincing people to care. They already care. In fact, they care very deeply. So why aren't they doing anything about it for most people? The sad truth is that a lot of people haven't been asked, especially people of color, who are more likely to be alarmed or concerned about climate change than white people. Most of them don't have a credible path to take action. They don't know, as most people don't know, what they can do to make a difference. So one of the things that Greenpeace does is reach out to people and ask them to take that action. And if you're asking people to take action, there's a few things that you should always remember. One, be honest, accurate, and credible. You want to build trust with your audience, and it is pretty hard if you break that trust with false or misleading information to get it back. Especially remembering that when you're doing this advocacy, there will be people who want to say that you are lying and not being credible and not being accurate. So knowing that you are is really important. To tell people why it matters, not why necessarily climate change matters, but like, why does this specific thing that you're talking to them about matter? Why is this pipeline important? Why is this law important? A lot of people want to act, but it's very easy to feel helpless or like someone's actions are not going to make a difference. So we have to show them that it does, that it's connected to the fight in a big way. One of the ways that we do that is to tell stories. Stories are what create emotional resonance. They make people remember what you told them, make people listen to what you want to say, and they make the story about people. I think this is one of the things that historically has been difficult in the environmental movement, because when we really look at what the impacts of climate change are, this is not just about saving polar bears or rainforests. This is about saving people. This is about the people who are dying from fossil fuel infrastructure right now. And it's about the people who want to have a habitable planet in the future, which can't happen if we have runaway global warming. Keep it simple. People who are advocating against climate action, keep it very simple. And we have to do the same thing, even though that's hard. And we want to be speaking from a position of science and from a position of accuracy, but we have to find ways to keep it short and simple and straightforward. And then give people something to do, give them a call to action. And then if they do that and they like doing it, give them more things to do and bigger things to do, and let them really have an opportunity to be part of the movement. And all this to say, like, there are places that I have talked to that see communications as a way to talk about what an organization is doing. That's definitely not the way I see it. Communications are a way to win. So when we talk about this, like, we are mobilizing people to take action, to do things that we think will actually contribute to fighting the climate crisis. Communications is one of the tools in that bucket. I want to give a really concrete example before I dive into talking about some campaigns in more detail. This is Vicky. She's someone that the indigenous leader from the Philippines who I worked very closely with. And one of the sad realities of environmental advocacy is that I can put a target on your back. And it can make you be treated as a criminal by your own government or by people in power. Vicky's from the Philippines, and because she was speaking out for indigenous rights, her government declared her a terrorist, which she is very much not. She was a UN official and an indigenous leader and a grandmother, certainly not a terrorist. And she was in a position where she was afraid to go back to her country because she thought she would be arrested. And we asked, what can we do to help? And she said, get attention on the story, like have media coverage, have people talking about this. So this is one of the pieces that we placed to help tell that story, not just about Vicky, but about environmental defenders all over the world who are criminalized for taking action to protect their lands and to protect the resources that all of us rely on. And she credits this outpouring of attention in the media and the outpouring of statements and support and like all of the attention and communications around this with the Department of Justice not even showing up at her hearing, and she was able to be taken off that list and go back home. But that's one individual story. We can't necessarily always see such an immediate and like concrete impact, but we know that it does happen, and we know that when we build communications campaigns over time, we can win things using them. There are a lot of different ways to go about fighting climate change or doing environmental communications. I think stopping the criminalization of environmental advocates is an absolutely critical one. It's necessary to protect the biodiversity we all rely on, the oceans, the forests. And then on the other side of that, like we have to end fossil fuel expansion. There is no alternative, not if we plant 1 trillion trees or invest in carbon capture technology. Like this is the way that we know we can keep global warming to not reaching catastrophic levels. So in order to do that, how do you go about creating a campaign? First, you need a goal. That sounds like a really obvious one, but it's really important. And I've seen people have goals that are not concrete. We want to raise awareness about this, or we want people to care about this. The more concrete your goal is, the easier it is to really hone in on what is going to make it successful. And in particular, it's a lot easier to know who your target audience should be. How are you supposed to know what to say if you don't know who you're talking? So that is the way that we build successful communications campaigns. And the way that we reach those audiences, this is a phrase we use all the time, is to meet people where they are. And that means both figuratively and literally. So what's the messaging that will resonate with that audience? What are the values that they care about? And how do those values overlap with what you care about? And then literally, where will you reach them? Because you could have the best message in the world, and if they never hear it, that doesn't help you. So what channels are they interested in? What media do they read? Do you have a direct line of communication? Figuring all that is really important. Who are your key partners? Because none of these campaigns are ever fought alone. And I will go so far as to say, and probably say several times in this presentation, I have never been part of a successful campaign that did not include frontline community partners. The people who are impacted are the people that you want to be talking to and most importantly, listening to if you want to build a successful campaign. And then what are your moments? It's pretty hard to build a campaign if you don't know what are the time-bound things that you can focus on. What are the ways that you make it timely? That's part of telling people why your campaign matters. So, with all that said, I'm going to walk through 2 examples. One federal government related from my time here at Greenpeace, and one corporate campaigning example from my time at Sunrise. And an upfront note that you can do campaigns that are over several years and that are about changing hearts and minds in order to create the conditions to change the way that something works. And you can have very time-bound campaigns. We're trying to win this in the next couple of weeks or the next couple of months. And we have something that's happening that we need to be able to jump in on and take action. And that's what I'm going to talk about, one of those examples first. So what makes a comms campaign successful? Clear theory of change. And the example that I'm going to use is the dirty deal. You might be wondering, what is the dirty deal? Senators Schumer and Manchin wanted to push through a permitting side deal. That's what they called it. Well, actually, they didn't call it a side deal, a permitting deal, which sounds pretty innocuous. But what it actually would have done was stripped the Environmental Protection Act, stripped the Clean Water Act, and made it easier for dirty, polluting fossil fuel projects to move forward. And it would have made it so that the communities affected did not have as much voice in those decisions. So this was something that we definitely wanted to oppose. Our goal was very clear. We did not want this to pass in Congress, and it was we were told that it was going to pass last fall and that there was nothing that we could do about it. It was a done deal. It was going in the bill to fund the government. And the only people who could stop it was Congress. So that was our audience. And we decided that we were going to fight it after all. And this is our executive, actually, I don't think you can see my arrow. The woman with the megaphone is our executive director, Ebony Twiley Martin, standing beside leaders from a lot of different environmental organizations and environmental justice organizations, having a sit-in at the Senate where they were arrested for protesting the dirty deal. Spoiler alert, like this was not passed in the continuing resolution to fund the government. It was also not passed in the defense bill, which was their plan B, or the omnibus bill, which was their plan C. So this story that they tried to put out that this thing's just going to pass, just going to happen, did not happen, was defeated. Maybe not forever. It might come back, and if it does, we'll be ready. But in order to defeat it the first time, we had a lot of work to do. So first, we had to figure out how we were going to reach our audience, how we're going to reach members of Congress, because they're the only ones who can decide not to pass this. We knew that Biden would sign it if it got to his desk. So we tried to reach them everywhere that they would possibly look. We drove a truck around Capitol Hill with our messaging on it. We put ads in the Washington Post and the Hill. We, of course, had the sit-in with our executive director and other executive directors. We tried to create a surround sound experience so that everywhere they looked, they would see that we knew that this deal was dirty and that we were standing against it. And not just us, like Greenpeace was a part of this campaign, as were many other organizations working together to stop it. As much as the message matters, the messenger is important too. Ultimately, the story we were trying to tell, which we also had to make true, was that this didn't have support in Congress. Oops. Which meant that we had to make sure that the focus was on the fact that Democrats themselves were not going to vote for this. So when we reached out to media, we didn't say, quote, Greenpeace, talk about Greenpeace and our opposition. We said, the House members are not supporting this. This isn't going to pass. This doesn't have the support. So that was really important in messaging to other folks in Congress, and in particular to Schumer and to Nancy Pelosi. And of course, we had to mobilize people power. This is one of the key ways that Greenpeace works. And it's reaching out to our supporters, to our other Greenpeacers, to people that follow us and saying, take action. We need people in Congress to hear from their constituents that you don't want this to pass. So it was on our Fire Drill Friday show that we do with Jane Fonda, and we did our revolution. We did a town hall getting people to take action, and over 100,000 people wrote to Congress or did something else to draw attention to it. Over 900 signed up to go visit members of Congress, and we know quite a few of them actually did. Thousands called members of Congress. So we really tried to create that loud voice saying that this is not what people want. We are watching and we see what you're trying to do. What messaging resonated with our supporters? These were two of the pieces of content that were most popular. One is a picture of Ebony being arrested. Seeing other people take action is a really good way to mobilize people, makes people want to act. And then the other one is a meme, which was very timely because there was a horrible heat wave going on when this happened. And so it was one, like, memes do help to get attention, but also it was something that really resonated with what was going on for people. Now, perhaps the most important part of this was branding. Senator Schumer and Senator Manchin did not call this a dirty deal. In fact, they didn't really want to call it much of anything at all. They wanted it to pass quietly and without discussion. It was our job not only to drag this out into the light, to make it something that they would be recognized and talked about, but also to brand it. So here you can see an article in The Guardian where they call it the dirty side deal. This is in part because there was a great amount of messaging discipline across the movement to make this stick. If everyone was calling it something different, it would not have had the same power. So we weren't just like creating a narrative, we had to do it together as a movement. And a couple of other things to keep in mind about that campaign. Partnerships with frontline communities are key. It's part of the reason it was so powerful, was that their voices were a major part of it, more at the forefront. And that everyone was in agreement about the messaging they just mentioned. And we'll actually come back to that point more later in the conversation. A timely hook is necessary. So we could say, like, we need to stop this now. This is going to pass this week. This is going to pass next week, whatever the timing was, in order to really get people to pay attention and know, like, this is something they can do now. It's also something we go back to people afterwards and say, thank you. You helped do this. The Environmental Protection Act, which is this bedrock protection for our climate, is still there because of you, has not been stripped because of you. And then this last point, I just like to mention it because I think it's important for transparency. Campaigning costs money. Putting ads in the Washington Post and the Hill is not cheap. Buses with advertising are not free. I wish that they were sometimes, but it can take a lot, especially if you're trying to do this in a short period of time. And so I take it very seriously to think carefully about how we're using our resources, which for the environmental movement are a lot more limited than they are for oil and gas companies, and to make sure that we're using those effectively and willing to invest when those moments come where we really have the opportunity to win something. And so we're glad to say that the dirty deal was not passed. We don't know what will happen with our new Congress in place. Hopefully, I think it will be difficult for them to pass anything, but we'll be ready if and when the day comes where they try to bring us back. And now I'd like to talk about a different kind of campaign, the insurance campaign, and a couple of the things that made that really successful and really fun to be a part of. Surprising angle, incredible allies, and a really good target. Now, why are insurance companies such a good target for climate campaigning? I'm actually going to let Senator Whitehouse explain this and give my voice a 3-minute rest because I think he does a nice job. It was definitely one of the key voices that is advocating against insurance companies, U.S. insurance companies' role in climate change. Let me make sure I started this. Please flag if you cannot hear me or if you cannot hear it, but I think I've shared correctly.
There's an important player in fighting climate change that nobody's talking about: the insurance industry. Sounds like a stretch? Bear with me. Insurance companies complain about the costs of climate change. Worse hurricanes, floods, and droughts mean higher insurance payouts. But at the very same time, here in the US, these companies provide a financial lifeline for the industries fueling the destruction of our planet. Believe it or not, American insurance companies insure fossil fuel projects and they invest in them too. That means they take the money you and I pay in premiums for our cars and our homes, and they pour it into fossil fuel companies. As of 2020, the U.S. insurance industry had $90 billion invested in coal alone. Fossil fuels need insurance companies, but insurance companies don't need fossil fuel. Fossil fuels drive up their claims and make a terrible investment, and the premiums paid by fossil fuel companies represent only a tiny fraction of most major insurance companies' revenues. So what are they waiting for? Along with some colleagues in the Senate, I wrote to major U.S. insurers about the impacts of climate change. The insurers talk a big game about sustainability. They'll get rid of styrofoam in their cafeteria. They'll make their office buildings energy efficient. But these companies are not lifting a finger in Congress on climate change. And their trade associations are at the heart of the opposition. This is an industry that spends billions to get what it wants from Congress. But on climate, they don't show up. The bottom line, it's time for the insurance industry to wake up and show up, to put the money where their mouth is. They need to stop underwriting fossil fuel expansion and phase out insurance for existing fossil fuels. And they need to stop pouring consumer premiums into these industries. Otherwise, we're headed for a world where nothing is insurable, putting us on a path to a massive economic crash. It's a crash the industry actually warns us about. But even though they warn us, they do nothing to support climate legislation. And they even fund groups that oppose us. Like I said, time for this industry to wake up and show up.
Let's see, let's go back to slideshow. So fossil fuel companies need insurance. Can't operate without it. But insurance companies don't need fossil fuels. It's a tiny percentage of their premiums. They have lots of other ways to get business. That's part of what makes them such a compelling target. In some ways, a more compelling target than an oil company itself that you're perhaps asking to stop operating or to stop expanding. So I've always thought it was a really clever way of looking at climate change and looking at the climate crisis. And I think it's also worth noting that this campaign, the Insure Our Future campaign, which is sort of housed in the Sunrise Project, was operating alongside other campaigns that looked at all of the different financial infrastructure that fossil fuel companies, coal, oil, and gas companies need to operate. Banks, investors, asset managers, sort of all of these together are necessary for new projects and existing projects to operate. So we looked for overall systems and then moved to specific targets. We needed to tell the story of insurance writ large. I mean, you don't hear Senator Whitehouse name a single individual insurance company, but you also don't win a campaign just for that. So we had to do specific campaigns on Liberty Mutual, AIG, other insurance companies to really get their attention and create change. Here's theory of change, pressuring these the industry to stop supporting coal, oil, and gas, prioritizing the major insurers that could play a role in those industries. One of my favorite tactics for reaching the insurance industry as an audience that I'm sharing because I found it interesting and fun was to advertise on LinkedIn to the employees of insurance companies. Insurance employees, by and large, may not even know that their companies insure oil and gas expansion and new coal mines. And the insurance industry is getting progressively older in the United States, needs to hire a lot of young people if it's going to keep operating successfully. We know, statistically speaking, young people care more about climate change. So they really don't like it when we talk to their employees about it. And that made it a really effective target of directly reaching the industry. Partnering with frontline communities was also an absolutely critical part of this fight. In many cases, like, we were following their lead on what would be helpful. We were partnering with them as they told their stories and as they asked for insurance and as they demanded for insurance companies to stop insuring projects that were ruining their lands, threatening their health, and that were destroying our global climate. So on the right is a picture of a protest outside Liberty Mutual. On the left, actually, I'm not sure, but I think it'll still be the same right and left for you all. There was a commitment last October, the first insurance company agreeing that they would not invest in projects that did not have community consent. So that's a huge protection for both communities, but also for the environment, because as so often happens, these two really go hand in hand. And it really is an important and successful way of fighting climate change. I already mentioned that you need to tell stories, and site fights, as we call them, are one of the best ways to do that. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline in Canada, there's an existing pipeline and then an expansion pipeline that's being built alongside it. There have been, I believe, I think it's over 80 spills from the existing pipeline. And the new pipeline, if it has spills, could have absolutely devastating impacts on a whole bunch of people and on our climate in Northwest Canada and the United States, and is really something that folks there have been leading opposition against for a long time. So that first clip is an op-ed that Kaya George wrote for the Toronto Star. She is a Tsleil-Waututh youth activist. She was 22 when she wrote this, calling on Trans Mountain insurers to stop insuring the project. Because if they stop, the project actually can't go forward. And they, Indigenous peoples and First Nations, have led a massive fight against Trans Mountain insurance companies, and have gotten quite a few to say that they will not renew the policy. I was part of working with them on an Indigenous-led week of action, 25 actions, 4 continents, incredible show of solidarity across the world, calling on insurers to drop the projects. Became a national story in Canada. A lot of international outlets covered as well. And it was something that our allies and our partners in Canada could use to leverage in other ways to strengthen overall advocacy against Trans Mountain. And of course, got insurers to cut ties with the project. I think we're at 17 now, though I'm no longer working on the campaign. So I'm not actually sure, it could be more at this point. And also leveraged it to get policies for insurance companies to say they wouldn't even be part of that industry anymore. So Chubb, which is the world's largest property and casualty insurer, got out of tar sands altogether. Now, when they got out of, so centering rights really was like a critical part of winning these campaigns. Like, we had to tell stories, we had to humanize it, we had to make it real, because if you just say you want to talk to people about insurance, it sounds really boring on the face of it, and it's hard to see, like, what does that actually have to do with anything that I care about? And so partnering with people and hearing their stories was really critical to all of the successes that the campaign has had. Now, when Chubb got out of tar sands, they didn't actually admit to it. They sort of tried to do it quietly. And we wanted them to, well, we actually did not know that they'd done it, but we really wanted them to stop insuring tar sands. And so one of the ways we did that was to make it personal. I understand that this could actually be uncomfortable for some people, but the CEOs of companies that play a major role in the climate crisis are often really important campaigning targets. They care about their public image, even if they're not household names. They don't want to be dragged into the light in this way. So this picture is the CEO of Chubb, Evan Greenberg, wreathed in flames with the signs that you can see outside the US Open on the day that they were sponsoring it. And the picture was all wonderful. So picture later showed up in a bunch of articles, including this Washington Post one. But personalizing the campaign to Evan Greenberg, even though people walking by this will have no idea who Evan Greenberg is, was part of getting them to say publicly. They told a Financial Times reporter that they were out of tar sands. Now, I've been mentioning this, so just other examples of ways that we've told the story of insurance. including the now this video. Could give a whole presentation on like how to get media outreach, how to use media outreach. It's definitely a topic all to its own, but I feel that it's worth mentioning a bit of the specifics. Media outreach can be a really critical tool to pressure your targets. It's a way to make sure that it's a way to maximize and like have a bigger and louder voice than you might have just with yourself or your organization. And so if you're trying to get media outreach on a topic, my very brief explainer of I think the best ways to do that are, what do you have? What do you have to give people? An interesting spokesperson can be really helpful. So this is an op-ed in Teen Vogue by somebody who was actually a risk management student who was really interested in working for the insurance industry, and then was found out what their role is in climate crisis. New data or research is always helpful if you can say that it's new in particular. And a story that hasn't been told. That Washington Post article on the previous screen was not actually tied, even though they used that great picture, was not actually tied to any particular moment. It was, what's this surprising, what could finally stop new coal plants? Pulling the plug on their insurance. It was a story that the reporter found interesting. And we provided them with a lot of data and information and examples that they could use to tell the story. And so they wrote this article on it. So that's like, first, what do you have to work with? Second, what's going on in the world? Let's evaluate your landscape. What's getting coverage? That could either be a distraction from what you're trying to do, or it could be something that you hook to. Like there's a big moment happening in the news in the world, like that's something that you can be talking about. That's something that you can be tapping into. My note of caution with that is that if you're tapping into a bigger moment, make sure that it is in line with justice to do so. There are tragedies where it makes a lot of sense to talk about why that's happening. And then there are tragedies where maybe it just is the time to be silent. That's something that we think about a lot. And then of course, know your media audience. Like the media is not a monolith. Insurance trade press is interested in doing things in the Washington Post. The more that you get to know the media, get to know the individual reporters and their interests, build relationships with them. Understand, of course, what's your target audience reading. Using that as a means of reaching them will work much better if you really understand that media and if you really understand how you can best communicate with them as an audience in order to get coverage of your issues. Briefly, the result of all that, there are 40, this is not just for the Trans Mountain campaign, this is 6 years of insurance campaigning. There are 41 global insurance companies that restrict coal insurance, 13 for oil and gas, 22 for tar sands. There's a lot of other stats on here that I'm not going to go into right now. But what does all that mean? It means that it's a lot harder to get insurance if you want to do a new coal mine. It is a struggle and it is very expensive. And if you're paying a whole bunch for insurance, that money got to come out of somewhere else in your budget. So we want to make it harder for these projects to go forward. And the oil and gas one, the oil and gas fight's going to be harder, but that's ramping up now. It's an incredible campaign and I have so much faith in the people that work on it. So I'm actually really excited to see what they do next. Last, just a few things that I also want to mention. Internal matters matter. There are a lot of different organizations out there working on these issues, and they work in a lot of different ways. And so if you end up wanting to go into this field, it's important to look at like, what are the structures of that organization? How do they do communications? Sunrise Project and Greenpeace are very different and both have like very successful communications operations. In Sunrise, it really is like the campaigns working well, I should also preface this by saying this is how it was when I was there. Things change rapidly in this movement. But when I was there, it was campaigns really working as independent units and comm staff were reporting to campaign leads. And there was no centralized communications team really. And they were operating often through brands. So Ensure Our Future was the way that we referred to the campaign we were working on publicly. It had its own branding, its own website, its own spokespeople, its own coalition, whole separate thing. And that's part of why it was able to operate sort of separately from things like BlackRock's Big Problem, which is another Sunrise campaign. Greenpeace is very different in this regard. There's a centralized communications function. We have a chief communications officer who sits on our senior management team. So that's basically like our most senior leadership body. And we have different staff on communications who are embedded in the campaign. So they become experts in their campaigns and really work on them. But they report up to communications leadership, which allows us to mobilize this one brand that we're using, Greenpeace, this one large audience that doesn't see us as different campaigns, but sees just Greenpeace, in order to tell them one story and to connect all of those different things that we might talk to them about. And to use, the one email list, we do segmented, whereas that's not the case for Sunrise. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. Both are really valid, and there's other ones out there too. And then finally, I just have to mention that people of color have been on the front lines of this fight the entire time. And it's really important to be actively anti-racist, not just in your external communications, but internally at your organization, especially if you are a white person. When I look at at Greenpeace, look at the organization staff, look at its leadership. Those are important because ultimately you're not going to win otherwise. And also, racial justice and climate justice are so inextricably linked. The same people that are trying to disenfranchise people of color and that are trying to take away their rights and are trying to silence their voices are the same ones that are pushing fossil fuels and oil and gas on us and trying to prevent a transition to renewables. So in some ways, it really is one fight. And if we don't fight against racism, then we're not going to be able to win climate fights. So I think that's really important to consider. And if you are going into this kind of field, that's the type of organization that I would recommend looking for. And then I hope I can circulate these slides to you afterwards. If you're interested in volunteering, you'd be very welcome. And I'm always happy to hear from people. So my emails here, always welcome people who want to ask about this line of work. But anyway, thank you so much for listening and for having me today. That's the end of my presentation, and I am very happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was great. That was really, really helpful. We can leave this slide up for a second so people can get your email if you like. And then when you're ready, you can stop sharing your screen so we can see you kind of front and center. But I would welcome folks to ask questions at this time of our speaker. So that's folks in the room. If you have questions, just raise your hand and you can go ahead and ask those questions. Folks on the Zoom, you can certainly ask your questions in the chat, and I would encourage you to do so at this time. Or you can raise your little digital hand and we can call on you. So yeah, questions for our speaker.
I just have a general question. Do you ever get to go on the Greenpeace ships?
I have a very sad story about this, which is that I was going to train to do the onboard campaign training last fall, and unfortunately the crew got COVID. Therefore, I was not able to do the training, but I am very much hoping that I will get that opportunity sometime soon. They're a really fun way to campaign, and we're talking about potentially having the ship in the US at some point and what that might look like. So stay tuned, but hopefully sometime soon.
Great. Other questions for our speaker, please? Yeah, you may need to speak up.
Okay, sometimes, there's a kind of a smaller point of topic talking where, people contest if like donations are more valuable or volunteer hours. As somebody that like who's as a part of the organization and more of like an executive position, like which are you happier about receiving? Would you rather get like a new volunteer or like a large donation? Is there like a certain dollar amount that is then more valuable than a single volunteer?
Oh, that's such an
Will you,
interesting.
you get that okay? I wasn't sure. Should I repeat it?
Yeah, I did. That is such an interesting question. And I would say that we absolutely need both. I'm actually like really curious what our fundraising team and our organizing team would say about that. Or I don't know that there's a dollar amount I can put to one being more valuable than the other, but I really think that we need both. And I'll say, like, there are people out there that definitely just want to give money. And there are people out there that just want to volunteer. And there are people out there that don't really have time or space to do either, but they want to sign petitions. And we need all of them. And the thing that I don't think people necessarily saw in kind of the earlier days, perhaps, of the organization was a lot of people want to do multiple things. So there were, I think, separate lists for like donation and for volunteering, which doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Like people want to do both. But I would say ultimately, like when we say that we're powered by people power, like we don't take any money from corporations. We don't take any money from governments. Like we need donations from people to operate. But we also need volunteers. And like when I talked about winning the dirty deal fight, we could not have done that without our volunteers, without our action pods, without people being willing to pick up the phone or write to Congress or show up. And a lot of times those volunteers are then like the ones that get really involved. They're training other volunteers. Like to me, like that's in some ways, a more exciting process to be a part of, but really need both. Kind of curious if I can get more of an answer from our organizing and fundraising teams. And if I do, maybe I can get back to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, just kind of riffing off of that, I'm curious, thinking specifically about the dirty deal, that campaign effort. I'm wondering if you ever got any feedback from any of the legislators or their aides or anything about what aspect of that was more impactful to the Congress people? Was it having their constituents contact them? Was it seeing the big billboards and that sort of being daylighted? Do you have any idea what that might have been? Was it media coverage? I mean, I know it would be you'd have to have some inside information to know how individuals might respond.
Yeah, I don't know that we can say which thing was the most important, but the strategy was really around like building that unrelenting pressure. And so kind of having it everywhere, I believe, was particularly important. I'll also say, like, forgot to mention this when I was talking it through. We also directly were in contact with these folks. So they knew, like we said, we will be advocating strongly against this deal. And so we had those direct conversations as well. And we were trying to get 40 members of the House to come out against it. And we got almost 80 at the end. So we're really happy with how that turned out. But I think it didn't necessarily need to be like these elements, but it needed to be a lot of loud elements. My sense is that the things that were happening kind of in person to a degree in Washington, D.C. were a really critical part of it. But I think it all was adding up to create that impact. If we had just done one of these things, it probably would not have been as successful.
Great. Other questions? Yeah, George.
Yeah, I read that, was going through your work history and I saw that you ghostwrited some opinion pieces. Well, is that a communication strategy? What's the purpose of ghostwriting?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are ghostwritten because there are a lot of things that are ghostwritten because it's hard for people to write them themselves. But when I do ghostwriting, and this is not just in environmental advocacy or communications, this is everywhere. And ghostwriting really helps people tell their stories that they might have difficulty telling otherwise, especially like if you're trying to make an op-ed be placed. Having someone who understands the media landscape well enough to know how to do that is really important. But whenever I am writing for other people, like I'm sitting down with them first and I'm hearing their story, it is absolutely their words and their message that I'm helping to get down on paper for them and maybe cut down to the appropriate length and things like that. Very common in, I would say, every aspect of communications, but really allows people to help get their stories out there in a way that they might not get to otherwise. I'm seeing a question in the chat. What kinds
The
of
question in the chat's really interesting. Yeah, if you could read it, that'd be great.
Yeah, what kind of campaigns have you seen fail? What strategies do you tend to stay away from? I'm like thinking of a specific example, but I don't know if that one will come back. So it's the best thing that I can say. Like I've seen it, campaigns fail most when there's no clear theory of change, when there's no clear audience, when it doesn't have like a timeliness hook or an urgency hook. I think also when there are like too many steps in between your target and like what you think the impact is. So what I mean by that is it can be really hard, for example, if you're like, I'm going to target this company because they're giving donations to people in Congress who are doing something that I'm against. The problem with some of those is like, they may be anyone who's donating big to Congress. If you're a corporation, you're probably donating to both Democrats and Republicans. You want both sides to be beholden to you. You want whatever side wins to be beholden to you. And you have lots of money to throw at them. So those kinds of arguments often don't resonate very well. There are exceptions because there are people that are like very much connected to one side. But insurance companies, for example, donate to both. They want both of them. So I haven't found that to necessarily be as an effective an argument as I might like it to be. I'd also say like there's money in politics is a huge problem, but it can be hard for people to see like, okay, well, even if this company stops, like how much of a difference does that really make? So I've seen campaigns on that fail as well when they're like, oh, like, we really need this company to stop giving money to Congress. It didn't really resonate for people. We're trying to create that audience and create getting people interested in it. Yeah, I think it's really about working this through. And also like there are a lot of campaigns that I would say don't fail, but only partially succeed. And sometimes we take those as victories anyway. I'm thinking about the Adani Group's Carmichael coal mine in Australia, which is a lot smaller than it would have been before the decade plus of campaigning that has happened against it and against its financiers and insurance companies and investors and all of that. But I think like if you can't clearly answer who are we trying to reach, do we think they're movable? Not every target is movable. And you have to know or be able to reasonably guess, like, can I get this target to move? What kind of pressure will get them to move? And you might be wrong, but I've seen campaign proposals where the target just likely isn't movable. And then I'll also say, I've seen campaigns fail when organizations don't resource them appropriately. we want to do everything. There's so many worthwhile causes just in the environmental movement, forget like everything else. And there's really a tendency to want to do everything. There's so many problems in the world. But I've seen organizations get spread too thin and not be able to really resource the campaigns that they do have. And then I've seen campaigns fail for that reason. I'm sure there are more examples, but
I had another question that actually came up in some of our earlier work in class that was interesting. We talked a little bit about the issue of clicktivism, this idea that it's very easy for us in this digital age to sign an online petition or click a button to support some cause. Do you see that? I guess from your perspective as someone who focuses on communications, where does that sit with you? Is that is clicktivism a good thing and then it's engaging people, or is it just an easy out?
I don't necessarily have a simple answer to that question. I think it's most effective when you use it to bring people in and then encourage them to do more. So what we'd call like a ladder of engagement. So maybe first they click a petition and then we ask them to donate and then we ask them to do, and like there are people that will move up that ladder and will be more active and engaged and involved. Petition signatures alone, I don't necessarily know are particularly effective, but I have seen some great creative tactics where people will, for example, deliver all of them in a really interesting way. So actually the image I showed of the pipeline with Liberty Mutual, they had like these big boxes and it was technically a petition delivery. And so they did get all the signatures in advance, but it was really about them being out there and the visuals of it. So it was a component, but just sending a petition, I don't think by itself definitely necessarily helps. I also want to recognize like we might wish that everybody had the money to donate or like the power to get out there and like lead a volunteer action pod. But if you're like, I don't know, a single mother working 3 jobs, that might not be realistic. And so if there's another way for you to be involved, I don't think it's necessarily wrong for people to engage that way. I do think it's important if you're going to ask people to do that, to think about how you will use it and think about your target. Is your target going to be persuaded by petition signatures? And if the answer is no, then it's not a good tactic. So I think it's the responsibility to some degree of the organization putting out the petition to think about how they're going to use it. There was actually kind of wish now I'd showed this video. Greenpeace brought a piano to the Arctic and had someone play like this absolutely beautiful piece they'd written for the Arctic, like on a piano on a platform that we had built to look like a floating iceberg. And you actually see ice collapsing in the background. And this was the way that we delivered the petition of people asking to save the Arctic. And it was an incredibly powerful video. I can send it if I send some follow-up things, which I'd be happy to do, I can include it. So there are times when it's part of your strategy and there are times when it's not. And I would hope that I would want people to get more involved. They can. And I also understand like that's not feasible for everybody.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm realizing what time it is. It is that time, and I want to be respectful of you and the time that you've given us, Jamie. Thank you so much for joining us today. Everybody, let's go ahead and give so much for being with us today. And I am going to end